Snow had been falling on Asheville, North Carolina since Christmas Eve morning, 4 inches by noon, and more coming. Corporal First Class James Whitfield was driving back from the veterans' shelter on Merriman Avenue with an empty serving tray and a dog who had been restless for the last 6 blocks. In a way, that had nothing to do with the weather. In the back seat, Pepper stood with both front paws on the center console, which she had never done in 3 years, and pressed her nose toward the passenger window with the fixed, certain attention of a dog that has already decided where she needs to be. On the sidewalk outside a pale yellow house on Kimberly Avenue, a woman in a wool coat and snow boots was taping a handwritten sign to her front door, working slowly in the cold. And when James read the sign through the windshield, he pulled over before he understood why. What that Marine and his K9 uncovered inside that yellow house on Christmas Day would reveal a secret that a care management company had been counting on nobody finding, and remind an entire neighborhood what it had agreed to be 31 years ago, when one woman first set 4 extra places at her table for people she had never met. If stories about the ones who show up, and the ones who made it worth showing up for, belong in your Christmas, subscribe before we go any further. There are more of them waiting. James Whitfield had joined the Marines at 20 because his older brother had, and because his older brother was the person he had spent his entire childhood trying to keep up with, and because enlisting had felt, at 20, like the version of keeping up he could actually achieve. The brother's name was Calvin. Calvin had served 1 tour, coming home, gone to work for a construction firm in Asheville, and was by any measure a good man living a good life. James had served 3 tours, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and had come home at 29 to the same city as Calvin, and the same family dinners on Sundays and the same streets he had grown up on, both carrying something Calvin had not carried, which was the weight of having been the person who went further and stayed longer and brought back more than he had intended to. It was 31 now. He worked part-time at the Veterans Shelter on Merriman Avenue and spent the rest of his time doing what he could for the city he had grown up in and come back to. It was not a man who talked about what the tours had done to him. He had learned that the way through anything was the next action, the next task, the next person who needed something. It had organized his life around available usefulness, which had served him well enough that he had not yet examined whether it was also a way of not standing still long enough for what he'd been through to catch up. Christmas Day at the shelter had ended at 1. He had stayed until the last dish was washed, which was what he always did, and driven home with the empty tray, and Pepper and the quiet that came after a long morning of being needed. Pepper was a Catahoula leopard dog, 5 years old, mottled gray and white, with pale blue eyes that gave her an expression of permanent, serene watchfulness. She had come to James through a veteran placement program after her previous handler, a woman named Corporal Dana Lee, who had been medically discharged from the Marines with a spinal injury. I'd been unable to keep her. James had been on a waiting list. The program coordinator had called him on a Thursday and told him Pepper was ready. Anne had driven to the facility that afternoon, and Pepper had walked to him across the intake room and sat down in front of him and looked at him with those pale blue eyes, in a way that made the coordinator say, entirely without sentiment, "She already knows." In the field, Pepper had been a detection and patrol dog. In James's apartment, she was the same dog in a smaller jurisdiction, monitoring, tracking, noting deviations from pattern, with the interest of someone for whom normalcy was not comfort but data. She did not stand on the center console of a moving vehicle. She had not done it in 3 years. James registered the deviation and did not dismiss it. Read the sign through the windshield. Christmas dinner. Strangers. Welcome. Come in. He pulled to the curb. The woman who answered the door was 86 years old, and she was dressed for company. A red cardigan over a white blouse, air-white hair pinned with the care of someone who had been raised to meet people at the door looking like you had been expecting them, which she had. She opened the door and looked at James, then at Pepper, then back at James, and she said, "I wasn't sure anyone would come this year." She said it without sadness, as an observation, a data point. The statement of a woman who has been setting extra places for 31 years and has learned to hold the uncertainty of whether they will be filled. James said, "I saw the sign." She said, "Then come in. Dinner's been ready since noon." Her name was Loretta Haynes. She was 86 years old and had lived in the yellow house on Kimberly Avenue since 1968. when she and her husband Philip bought it for $19 million on the strength of Philip's salary as a high school history teacher and Loretta's conviction that this was the house and this was the street. And that was simply that. Philip had taught for 34 years at the same school, and Loretta had been a county librarian for 27. And they had been, in the estimation of everyone who knew them, the specific kind of couple whose quality was not dramatic, but whose consistency was the sort of thing a neighborhood is made of. They had no children, not for lack of wanting, but for reasons Loretta had never explained to anyone, because the shape of her life was her own business. The Christmas dinners had begun in 1992. A woman named Gloria, who lived 3 houses down, had mentioned at the library that she would be spending Christmas alone that year. Her daughter had moved to Seattle, and flights were expensive, and Loretta had said without particularly planning to. "Come to dinner," she had said an extra place. Gloria had come. There had been good food and an argument about a crossword puzzle, and a great deal of laughter, and when Gloria had gone home at 9 in the evening, she had said at the door, "Next year, I'm bringing someone." She had. The year after that, Loretta had put a sign on the door, because it seemed more dignified than calling around. 4 extra places every year for whoever came. The rule was simple. You had to be a stranger. People who knew Loretta could come to dinner any other night of the year. Christmas was for the ones who didn't know her yet. 31 years. 112 strangers. Not one of them had been turned away. Philip had died in 2017, a Tuesday in February, peacefully at home. And Loretta had set 5 extra places that Christmas instead of 4, because one of them was his. The seat stayed empty. It had stayed empty every year since. Nobody sat in it, and nobody needed to be told not to. The house showed the care of someone who had been tending it for 55 years, with the specific attention of a woman who understands that a house is not a possession, but a practice. The kitchen smelled of roasting meat and cinnamon, and the particular warmth of a wood stove that had been going since morning. There was a table in the dining room set for 6, 4 extra places, and Philip's, with cloth napkins, and the good china that came out once a year. In the center of the table was an Advent wreath with 3 candles burned down and 1 still white, unlit, and beside it a small framed photograph of Philip at what appeared to be a school picnic. Laughing at something off camera, Pepper walked in from the front hall and stopped at the entrance to the dining room. She looked at the table, she looked at the unlit candle. Then she looked at Loretta, who was still in the kitchen, and then back at the table, and her pale blue eyes moved across the room with the unhurried interest of a dog cataloging what matters. James sat down at the table. For a long moment, it was just him and Pepper, and the smell of the kitchen, and the snow coming down outside the window. And he understood, in the way that sometimes happens when you stop moving long enough to feel where you are, that he had been given something he had not known he needed. Have you ever known someone like Loretta? Someone who set extra places year after year without asking for credit, who made room for strangers as a matter of practice, as if hospitality were simply the shape of a well-lived life? If you've known someone like that, tell me about them in the comments. Let's fill this section with their names. 2 others came that afternoon. A man named Arlo, 53, who had walked past the sign with the wariness of someone who had accepted charity before and found it conditional, and who relaxed over the meal into something closer to himself, and a young woman named Desta, 27, a nursing student from Ethiopia who argued cheerfully with Arlo about whether American cornbread was better or worse than injera. A debate Loretta referred from the head of the table with the composed authority of a librarian who had been the neutral party in passionate disagreements for 27 years. Philip's place was empty. Nobody sat in it. Nobody needed to be told. James helped with the dishes after. Pepper lay under the kitchen table and monitored the room with her pale blue eyes. Loretta moved through her kitchen with the efficiency of someone who has been cooking in the same space for decades and knows where everything is without looking. And she and James moved around each other in the particular synchrony of people who have, without discussing it, agreed on how a shared task should be done. It was during the dishes that James noticed the envelope on the counter. It was not hidden. It had simply been put there, set against the backsplash, behind the dish rack, with the particular placement of something that had been read and put down and not looked at again, because looking at it did not change it. It was from a company called Crestwood Care Management based in Charlotte. The return address had the logo of a corporation, a stylized leaf, green and white, that James did not recognize. He did not pick it up. He noticed it. He also noticed, when Loretta reached for a high shelf for the serving platter, that she favored her right arm over her left, and that the sleeve of her cardigan, pushed back from her wrist by the motion, showed a bruise along the inside of her forearm, yellow-green, old enough to be a week or more. That she did not acknowledge, and that she pulled her sleeve back over without comment. He said nothing. He dried the platter she handed him. He put it away where she showed him it went. When they were back at the table with coffee and a particular kind of fruitcake that Loretta said she had been making from the same recipe since 1979, and which was, contrary to the general reputation of fruitcakes, genuinely excellent, James said, "Miss Loretta, can I ask what you meant when you said you weren't sure anyone would come this year?" She held her coffee cup in both hands. She looked at Philip's place at the table. She said, "My daughter." James said, "I didn't know you had a daughter." "I didn't," she said. "For 51 years, I didn't. Then in 2019, a woman named Sandra contacted me. She had been placed for adoption in 1968, the year Philip and I bought this house." She paused. "We had a daughter in March of 1968. He was 29. Philip was 31. We were not able to keep her, and I have not spent one day in 55 years not knowing that." She said this in the same steady voice she used for. Everything but hands around the coffee cup had tightened. "Sandra found me. We have had 4 years of building something. She was going to come this Christmas. She called on the 23rd to say she couldn't." James said, "Why couldn't she?" Loretta sighed. She didn't say exactly. She said something had come up with her care situation. She stopped. She uses a wheelchair. She has since a car accident in 2015. She lives in a care facility in Charlotte that manages her support needs. Loretta looked at the envelope on the counter. "That letter came 2 weeks ago. I haven't fully understood it." James looked at the envelope. Pepper had gotten up from under the table. She walked to the counter, stopped at the envelope, and sat down. She looked at James. He got up. He picked up the envelope. He read it. What Crestwood Care Management had sent Loretta Haynes 2 weeks before Christmas was a letter informing her that her daughter's current care plan had been reviewed and that in-person visitation from non-designated contacts would be restricted effective January 1st under a new facility protocol. Loretta was not listed as a designated contact. Sandra had attempted to add her in October. The request had been processed as pending. The letter did not explain how to resolve the pending status. The letter did not provide a contact name. The letter provided a general inquiry number and a reference code. James turned to page 2. Page 2 informed Loretta that should she wish to pursue contact, she would need to complete a Form 14C, which could be requested from the facility administrator. And that processing time was 4 to 6 weeks, which would place the resolution in mid-February at the earliest. He folded the letter. He set it on the table. He looked at Loretta, who was watching him with the expression of a woman who has been watching people read things and react to them for 27 years as a librarian, and who had learned to read the reader before the read finished the page. He sighed. "Has Sandra told you she wants to see you?" Loretta said. "Every time we speak." He said, "Have you spoken to anyone at the facility directly?" "I called the general number," she said. "Twice. I was told to submit the form." He said, "Did Sandra know about this letter before it was sent?" Loretta was quiet for a moment. "She called me the day it arrived. She was... I have never heard Sandra angry before. She said she had not been consulted. She said she had not agreed to any restriction. She said she had submitted the designated contact form in October and been told it was processing." James sat with that. Pepper came from the counter and put her chin on the table edge next to the folded letter and looked at him with her pale blue eyes. She did not need to say anything. She had already said it. He thought about Dana Whitfield Lee, his sister, who shared his last name before she married and had kept it after because she said it was hers. Dana, whose spinal injury had ended her Marine career, and who was in a care facility in Greensboro, whose support situation James had spent 7 months fighting a care management company over. He knew what Form 14C looked like before he read the reference number. He knew what processing meant when it was a barrier rather than a status. He pulled out his phone. If you were in James Whitfield's position right now, sitting at a Christmas table, Reading that letter, knowing what you know, would you have made the call? Type yes or no in the comments. It had already dialed before he finished the question. The call was to a woman named Rachel Osei, a patient rights advocate in Charlotte, whom James had met at a Veterans Services conference in October and who had given him her card with the specific instruction to use it whenever the paperwork was being used as a wall. Rachel answered on the fourth ring with the voice of someone who had been expecting a call like this and had not been hoping for it on Christmas Day, but had picked up anyway because some things don't. Observe holidays. James described the situation in the precise order that made it usable. The form submitted in October, the letter sent in December. The visitation restriction effective January 1st. The 6-day window. Rachel was quiet for 8 seconds. Then she said, "The facility cannot restrict visitation between an adult resident and a family member without the resident's written consent. If Sandra did not consent in writing, the restriction is not valid. I need the facility name and the resident's full name. And I need you to keep that letter." James had the letter. He had Sandra's full name from Loretta in 30 seconds. Rachel said, "I'll have a response letter to the facility administrator before 5 o'clock today, Christmas or not." The administrator of Crestwood's Charlotte facility was a man named Glenn Marsh, and he arrived at Loretta's house on the 27th of December at her request, which Rachel had arranged by informing the facility, in formal terms, that an adult resident's family contact had a right to discuss her case with facility leadership, and that declining to meet would be noted in the formal complaint being filed with the North Carolina Division of Health Service Regulation. Ed drove a leased sedan and wore a jacket and tie on the 27th of December and had the composure of a man who had been in difficult meetings before and believed that composure was the same thing as authority. He sat at Loretta's dining room table across from Loretta, James, and Rachel Osei, who had driven from Charlotte that morning with a legal pad and a folder that was, by any visible measure, the most prepared thing in the room. Glenn Marsh looked at the folder. He looked at Rachel. He looked at James, who was beside Loretta with Pepper at his left side. It began with the prepared version of events, the facility's updated contact management protocol, the transition period, the processing queue, the 4 to 6 week timeline. It cited the way people say things that have been said before in the specific register of institutional explanation. He believed, or performed believing, that the explanation was sufficient. Pepper's growl was very quiet. It was not loud enough to interrupt anything. It was simply there, low, continuous, settled, a sound that said she had made an assessment and was holding it. She was positioned between Marsh and the table. She did not move. Marsh looked at the dog. The growl did not change. Rachel said, "Mr. Marsh, Sandra Haynes Okafor submitted a designated contact form for Loretta Haynes on October 14th. The form was acknowledged received by your facility on October 16th. According to the facility's own processing timeline, that form should have been resolved within 30 days. It was not resolved. A restriction letter was sent on December 11th without the form having been processed, without Sandra's written consent to the restriction, and without any notification to Loretta Haynes of her right to appeal. She turned the page in her folder. The restriction is invalid. The form will be processed today, and we will need Sandra's contact list updated before this meeting concludes." Glenn Marsh looked at the folder. He looked at the letter Rachel had placed in front of him, the one citing the specific North Carolina statute and the specific regulation and the specific violation. With the complaint case number already printed in the header, he looked at Loretta. Loretta Haynes, 86 years old, who had been sitting at this table for 31 Christmases with extra places for strangers, who had built something with a daughter she had spent 55 years missing, and had been denied access to it by a letter that cited a form she had not been told how to file. Looked at Glenn Marsh with the steady, direct assessment of a librarian who had spent 27 years helping people find what they were looking for. She sighed, very quietly. "She's been waiting to meet me her whole life." 7 words. Not to Marsh specifically, to the room. To the fact of it, the 55 years of it, the 4 years of building something, the Christmas Sandra had called to cancel, the empty chair where Philip should have been. The room absorbed it the way rooms absorb true things. Rachel's pen stopped moving. James was entirely still. Pepper did not stop and did not move and simply held her position between the man and the table. Glenn Marsh's composure did the thing composure does when it is the only thing holding a position that has already failed structurally. It stayed in his face for a moment by habit. Then it didn't. He looked at Rachel's folder. He said, "I'll need to make a call to the facility." Rachel said, "You can make it from here." He nodded from the dining room table of the yellow house on Kimberly Avenue, in front of Loretta and James and Rachel, and a dog who watched him without blinking until the call was finished. The designated contact status was updated while they sat there. Rachel confirmed the change in the system before Marsh left. Pepper watched him to the front door and did not relax until it closed. Then she walked to Loretta's chair and put her head in Loretta's lap. Just rested it there, the full weight of it, her pale blue eyes soft. And Loretta put both hands on her and pressed gently and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. And the house was warm, and the snow outside on Kimberly Avenue was still, and the Advent wreath on the table had its fourth candle lit now. Finally, the one that had been white and unlit on Christmas Day, burning steadily in the afternoon light. Sandra Hannes Okafor came to Asheville on the second Saturday of January in a van with a ramp, a suitcase that suggested more than a day, and the particular stillness of a person who has been moving toward a moment for a very long time. She came up the front walk in her wheelchair, and Loretta opened the door before she reached the porch, dressed for company, the same way she had been every Christmas for 31 years. James had come that morning to fix the porch ramp. He was still there when Sandra arrived. What happened in the doorway was not something that needed witnesses. And he stayed on the porch and did not look through the window, because some things are private in the exact proportion that they are sacred. He heard Loretta's voice, then Sandra's, then a silence that was not the absence of something but the presence of it. Pepper put her chin on James's knee. He stayed. Bev, from across the street, who had eaten at Loretta's table 3 Christmases ago and had been watching from her porch since the van pulled in, crossed with a covered dish, because that was the thing to do, which was a thing Kimberly Avenue had known since 1992. There are moments that feel less like coincidence and more like 31 years of practice arriving at the morning they had been preparing for. James Whitfield had driven back from the shelter on Christmas Day with an empty tray and a dog, who stood on the center console and pointed him somewhere he had not intended to go. He had not known, pulling over on Kimberly Avenue, that the yellow house held a woman who had spent her entire life making room for strangers, and who needed, on this particular Christmas, for a stranger to make room for her. He had not planned to stay. He had planned to stop, and then stayed, which is the only distinction that matters. Pepper had known where to point. That was always enough. This story is for everyone, whoever set an extra place, and for the ones who finally came through the door. Is there a Loretta in your life? Someone who gave their whole life in acts of quiet hospitality, who made room for others year after year, and who deserves to have that room made for them? Tell me their name in the comments. Let this section be full of the people who set extra places. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here when the next one comes. There are more stories waiting. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.